Hello, this is Genevieve Fontana coming to you from Canisius University in Buffalo, New York, and you're listening to the Did You Know podcast. You might not know it, but we have eco-heroines around our campus working to make it sustainable for future generations. For each show, I will spotlight earth-friendly initiatives and sit down with the change makers of our institution. Today we are spotlighting Dr. Katie Costanzo, an associate professor of biology and the director of the environmental science program. As an ecologist, her research focuses on how environmental changes impact insect populations. Dr. Costanzo is a very active member of the Canisius community as one of the pioneers of the East-West Community Garden and a member of Laudato Si. She also serves on the board of directors for the Western New York Land Conservancy. Thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you for having me.
So our first question is, please introduce yourself and explain a little bit about your position at Canisius.
Yes, so as you said, I'm Katie Costanzo, and I've actually been here, this is my 14th year now at Canisius University. Yeah, I have to get used to saying that.
Me too. I was like, that's why I changed the intro.
Yes. And yeah, I'm an associate professor in biology, and I've been directing the environmental science program for about 7 years now.
And as a teacher of introductory biology and the director of the environmental science program, please share your thoughts on the importance of integrating sustainability into various learning programs.
So I actually think sustainability just needs to be a part of our culture entirely, not just involved in certain learning programs. For far too long, humans have looked at nature historically as something to conquer or something to control, and we can see the products of that right now. We're experiencing like the greatest biodiversity loss that we have on record, and that coupled with the other impacts of climate change, we can even see how that's impacting ourselves through droughts and heat waves and extreme weather events. So we have to make changes, and we can't make changes that are in these silos and they're distinct and separate or added on to all of our everyday practices in society. It needs to be embedded as part of our culture and part of our society in all. So when you ask what the importance of integrating sustainability into various learning programs are, I look at it as, how can we incorporate it to everything?
Right.
Not just learning programs, but everyday practices of the entire society, not just Canisius community, but just society as a whole.
Yeah. And then can you talk a little bit about your research?
Yes. So I actually started as an undergrad. I was doing research on fuzzy little mammals, and I loved mammals. Nice. I initially wanted to work in zoos, and then I wanted to work with wildlife conservation and mammals. And I did my undergraduate research with small mammals, and I wanted to continue that for my master's. And while I was interviewing at a bunch of graduate schools, one of the schools, Illinois State University, when I went there to visit, this mosquito lab kind of snatched me up.
Now you're very far from mammals.
They were like, hey, you should come check out mosquitoes.
Yeah.
And never once did I think I would work with mosquitoes, nor was I interested in mosquitoes at the time. I was just very into the cuddly things.
Yeah.
But once they took me in their lab and started to talk to me about the questions they were asking and answering with mosquitoes and other insects as a model system, I got really intrigued. And I said, all right, my master's is a couple years. I'm going to give it a shot. And 25 years later, I'm still working with insects, particularly mosquitoes.
Right.
It happens to all of us who enter the field. We get sucked because insects are so fascinating. And entomology is one of my favorite classes to teach at Canisius because people don't know a lot about insects. They don't appreciate insects. And I love it when I have students take entomology and just seeing their eyes widen and they just fall in love with insects. Some of them go on pursuing a career in entomology, but others, even the pre-med students, they find it so interesting and they appreciate and value them so much more. So I still work with insects all these years later.
Yeah.
But I adore mammals to this day as well. And I still use mosquitoes as a model system because they're super hardy. They're easy to work with in the lab and easy to find in the field. But they're a great model system because they're really important ecologically. They're an important part of the food web. They have aquatic stages. The immature stages of larvae are aquatic, and then they also have a terrestrial stage, so they occupy different ecosystems within their lifespan. And there's a lot of invasive mosquito species, so you can look at how invasive species impact native communities. And then lastly, they're of medical importance because they vector several diseases important to not only animal health, but human health. So there's all these types of questions. It's like a multidisciplinary field just with this one organism.
That's so cool. Yeah.
It is. It's so cool. So some of the questions we ask in my lab are more ecological. Like we look at how does the environment impact the mosquito life history, mosquito phenology, or the timing of their life events. And then we work with invasive and native species, so we look at their interactions. But also, just because they vector diseases, there's also that medical aspect where we look at, okay, how does environmental change, and we really focus on temperature, impact traits in the mosquitoes that affect disease transmission by the vector.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of really cool questions. I can never do them all, but I want to do them all, but we have to pick a few. So yeah, I have students that are working more on like the conservation side of things in my lab, and then students who work more on the medical aspect in the lab.
So I know we don't have mosquitoes here, do we? I mean, like in a lab setting.
So I have colonies.
Oh, okay.
Currently at this point, we don't have any active colonies because it's early in the season.
Okay.
But later on in the summer, we'll have colonies. And so one of the jobs that the students do in my lab is they maintain the colonies. We blood feed them, not with animals. We use these artificial membrane feeders that have been developed just for mosquito rearing. So it's great. It's a very humane way of feeding mosquitoes.
Yeah.
We order blood from a medical company, and we just put it in this little apparatus. It heats it up to body temperature, and they feed right off of it.
That's so crazy.
It's really cool. So we don't have to use animals, which is fantastic. Because that's one of the worst parts of working with mosquitoes.
Yeah.
And then, we can raise them multiple generations and keep the eggs. The eggs are really hardy. You can store them for up to 8 months and hatch them when you need them. So we have colonies in the lab to produce the eggs that we then run the experiments on.
And then how long do mosquitoes live?
It's a great question. So the immature stage, from when they hatch from the egg, they have 4 different instars or larval stages. And that phase from hatch to adult, going through those 4 larval stages and then the pupae to the adult, can take anywhere from 1 week to several months depending on the environmental conditions. So things like temperature, that is a huge driver. Higher temperatures usually result in faster development. So you can get like a week to adult. But also resource levels and how crowded they are will impact that as well. And then the adults, we ran some experiments in my lab to look at how long they live if they're not eaten by a predator.
Right.
Just how long can those mosquitoes live if you provide them with a food source. So mosquitoes also are pollinators. So all the adults, males and females, will feed on nectar from flowers, where just the females take blood meals and feed on hosts for their reproduction. So if we provide the adults with ample food resources, they can live up to 3 months that we found in the lab, which is much longer than you would expect.
Yeah, because I feel like they're very vulnerable in the lab.
But usually in nature, they don't make it that whole 3 months. They'll usually be eaten at some point.
So then do you have to replace the amount of mosquitoes that are in your lab often because of their short lifespan? Yeah.
So what's great, like I said, is they will actually lay eggs. We put cups lined with oviposition paper, and they'll lay right on the paper. And then we store those eggs, and we can hatch out the next generation whenever we need to.
Oh, cool.
So if let's say the first generation is starting to dwindle down, they're getting old age, then we'll set up a hatch and hatch out the second generation and start that in a whole new cage.
Oh, okay. So a lot of mosquito questions. Yeah, sorry.
They're very interesting. You might get sucked, Jenny.
Yeah. And then because you said effect on native populations, do you do any work with like the native plants here and mosquitoes, or? So
particularly we look at how invasive mosquitoes impacted native mosquito populations.
Oh, okay.
Yes, so they interact with each other during both the immature larval stage in their habitats, but also in the terrestrial stages. So a lot of my research, beginning with my master's, looks at how this one invasive species, it's called the tiger mosquito. It was introduced to the United States in 1984, and it's one of the most abundant species in the country.
Okay.
And one of the reasons is because it's a superior competitor to native species during the larval stage. It's just really efficient at eating resources, has really high population growth. So it completely changes the community composition of mosquitoes in an area once it invades in a lot of instances.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of what I look at, like the mechanisms behind, okay, how is it displacing this species? And why isn't this other native species being displaced? How is it, not affected? How is it not being affected by this invasive species? So a lot of cool questions you can ask looking at that.
Right, and I didn't even know there were different species of mosquitoes. So then through your studies of environmental changes impacting insect populations, what are some most common local species that you see affected and by these changes?
Mm-hmm. Well, not just looking at my research specifically, but overall insect populations are hurting.
Yeah.
They've experienced a 70 to 80% decline overall on those that have been focused on in a study in the last 50 years.
That's
so
crazy.
It's really
yeah.
it's a really scary time because they're integral to every ecosystem's food web and the functioning of every ecosystem. So if the insect populations collapse, you're going to have a collapse of the entire food web.
Right, yeah.
So that's a big thing, and you'll notice, I notice here, I grew up in Buffalo, and there were fireflies everywhere when I was a kid, and they're always one of the species used because they're just so obvious because of their bioluminescence, but you don't see them anymore.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'll ask my students in entomology, just by a show of hands, how many students collected fireflies as a kid. And a handful, if even any,
really?
will raise their hand.
Yeah.
That's all I did as a kid. They were everywhere, So that's a huge impact around here. Another thing is, obviously, invasive species have devastating effects. I work with an invasive mosquito species, but in Western New York, you can see the impacts of the emerald ash borer.
Oh, right.
Which is that invasive beetle which has decimated our ash tree populations. There's also another invasive species of aphid. It's a tiny little insect called the woolly adelgid aphid, which is attacking hemlock trees. And so that's new to the area, relatively new. And so that's one that we have to keep our eyes on to make sure it doesn't have the same impact the emerald ash borer had.
Yeah.
And then from an agricultural standpoint, there's the spotted lanternfly, which has recently been introduced to the United States. It's a big problem in Pennsylvania. It has been spotted here, but it's not huge. Its populations aren't huge yet, but it can have devastating effects on grape, in the grape industry, because they target grape plants and grapevines. And so we have a lot of grape vineyards in the area.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
With Welch's and even with the wineries. So that's a big concern as well. So invasive species are huge because once they get into an area that they're not native to, they don't have the natural enemies. And even the plants haven't had the evolutionary history to develop adaptations such as the production of chemical secondary compounds, so that the insects can't consume them. So because there's not an evolutionary history with enemies and also plants that they feed on, they usually have huge negative impacts. That's a big problem here. And then climate change has changed the phenology or the timing of life events in a lot of organisms. Like when they migrate or when they first emerge in the spring. So everyone probably has noticed around them that things are different, right? A lot of things happen earlier now with climate change, right? Even birds are migrating here earlier. Like every year we document in our house when we first see the red-winged blackbird or when we first see certain species. And it's a little earlier every year. Same is happening with insects. So their phenology or timing of events is changing as well when they first hatch out of their diapause stage or emerge out of their diapause stage, when they start reproducing. So when their populations start to increase drastically. So that's changing. And one of our studies we're doing right now is looking at the phenology of mosquito populations. When they first start emerging from the eggs, when they first start seeking hosts or blood feeding, and when they enter diapause in the fall. Well, because everything's changing its phenology in response to the changing temperatures, unfortunately, they're not all responding in the same way. So an insect may shift its phenology a couple weeks, but a plant that it relies on as a pollinator for nectar may shift its phenology 3 weeks or 1 week. So you're having this asynchrony in the phenologies of species that interact and rely on each other.
Right, yeah.
And so that's a big concern, and you see a lot of asynchronies with plants, flowering plants, and pollinators, that they're not responding to climate change similarly.
Yeah.
Some may respond, like I said, a week, by shifting a week, others a couple weeks. So you're going to have this mismatch of pollinators, when their population is high, and when the plants that they pollinate are actually flowering.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different ways the environmental change is impacting our insect populations around us.
And then you talked about the aphids. So I know that ladybugs eat aphids. So have their populations increased at all, or they just cannot keep up with the amount of aphids?
So the woolly adelgid aphid encounters, so that targets hemlock trees in forested habitats. And so there are a number of insects that will consume them, but again, you don't have that evolutionary history because they're introduced. So predators that you would expect to consume them often don't, because they haven't evolved the ability to detect that prey.
Okay.
Right? Usually predators will detect prey by chemical compounds that the prey emit.
Yeah.
And then the predators will seek out the prey. Like insects, that's their biggest means of communication, is through chemical communication. So it takes time for the predators to not only be able to detect or pick up that scent, but then associate it with prey.
Yeah. And
then have that passed on from generations to where it's actually a common practice.
Got it. Okay.
So that's one of the reasons why, when you have an invasive species, they usually grow exponentially, because they're lacking that control, because you don't have a long evolutionary history. And it takes hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of generations, so.
Not a speedy process.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. But that's a great question.
Oh, thanks. So how could listeners help these vulnerable insect populations at home and in their communities?
Yeah. Many, many ways, more than anyone would think. Yeah. Like I said before, the insect populations are in dire trouble, and they need our help. And they're in dire trouble because of the things we have done, right? Yeah. So habitat loss, climate change, pesticides, you name it. Invasive species, we're
hurting everything.
Cause of their current demise in a lot of most instances. And as I mentioned before, also because they're so important to the structure of every ecosystem and the functioning of every ecosystem, we need to step in. And people often have a fear of insects, even my family members do, I can't tell you how many people still get their house sprayed. Yeah. Just spray the perimeter of their house to prevent any insects, But we have to accept, just like we have to accept we're part of this environment and natural community, and we rely on it. We also have to accept that insects are part of that community, right? And we need to value and appreciate them. So unless an individual is at harm, massive harm, I would say, if you have an allergy, right, to bees or other hymenopterans, fine, spray. Or if they're doing structural damage to your home, if you have carpenter ants, or even carpenter bees that are doing massive damage. I understand that. But every time there's a wasp nest, they usually will not bother you as long as it's not in an area that's highly trafficked. You should be able to get by. And you can also call some pest control companies will actually remove the net, relocate it as opposed to actually just killing them. But that's a big thing, is just try to avoid using pesticides as much as possible, because they don't only affect the species that you're targeting, like that wasp nest or the ants, even just the little tiny ants that aren't causing structural damage, or the stink bugs. We all have stink bugs. They're not doing any damage.
They're everywhere.
They're everywhere. It's another invasive species, that's why. If you spray the pesticide, it's not just targeting that insect. It's going to kill every insect in the area. So that's one way, is just use pesticides sparingly, if at all. And then also do things around your home that supports healthy habitat for the native insects. Things like, I know No Mow May there's a huge movement for that now. That's great. That's where you don't mow your lawn for the month of May to allow the flowering plants like dandelions and clovers and violets to actually take way, and this provides pollinator habitat. But it's hard not to mow your lawn for a month. Like, we honestly can't do it. It gets too long, and our lawnmower, it would be a mess after a month. But what we do is we choose areas on our yard that aren't highly trafficked, things in the way back or along the borders, where we're not using it recreationally. And we'll let that go 2 weeks before we mow it, or 2.5 weeks. But the areas that we use recreationally, we have our son, we're out in the yard playing, it's difficult when it's up to your knees, we still mow that regularly. But just allowing some of it to grow, that can help. Some people are in situations though where they can't do that. Let's say they live in a community where their HOA organization or even their neighbors don't appreciate long lawns. Just avoid using weeded feeds. You don't have to have this perfect monoculture grass. Turf grass does nothing for anyone ecologically. It's like an ecological sterile habitat. All right, so let the dandelions and the clover mix in there. Let the violets mix in there. And you can mow whenever you want to mow, but in between, those things pop right up, especially dandelions. They have a really amazing ability to actually, they have behavior where they will like crouch down when there's a disturbance, and so they all won't get mowed, and they'll pop back up.
That's so interesting. Really I didn't know that.
They even do it in the evening. So if you like go out in the morning before, the dew has dried up and the temperatures have risen, the dandelion flowers will be closed and they'll kind of be down, and then throughout the day they open back up.
Oh, cool.
It's really neat. But just reduce the amount of weed and feeds. Another thing people can do to help is just plant native plants on their property. People are finally paying attention to this, and it makes me so happy. But all those ornamental plants that we plant in our gardens that are not native, right? They don't have an evolutionary history with our wildlife. So a lot of our wildlife cannot consume them, cannot digest them, and does not consider them like food. So they won't eat them. And that's why they're so appealing to people in their homes, because you get these ornamentals from different continents around the world, and they do not experience herbivore damage from insects, or they say deer resistant. It's because there's no evolutionary history. Exactly. So if you just make the choice when you're at your greenhouses to plant native plants, that is going to support the local insect populations tremendously. And you can look up, I would actually recommend that you get them not from like the big box greenhouse stores, because they often use neonicotinoids, which is a pesticide that's actually inside the plant. So it will be inside the plant, even if you buy it as a seedling. It's not just sprayed around. The plant actually takes it up, and it will kill the insects even after it grows, and the insects are feeding on them. But you can find organic, non-pesticide treated native plants at a lot of local nurseries. There's several here. You can look them up online. And then another thing people can do is just try not to make your yard look so sterile. That's again, it's just like our history of wanting to control nature. Leaves are good. Leaf litter is good. Having your dried out dead flowers with the dried stems over through the winter and even in the spring is good. That provides habitat for all of our overwintering insects.
Yeah.
So a lot of the insects, they're in the form of pupae, and they're in that leaf litter in our gardens and under our trees. And they rely on the insulation of that leaf litter to overwinter throughout the winter months. And so when we rake up our leaves and put them at the curb, not only are we throwing out a lot of those insects and removing them from their habitat, we're also removing the leaf litter that if we didn't break up the insects, now they're not insulated. Mm-hmm. So this reduces their survival as well.
Yeah.
So waiting until, like, I know people get so excited in March when we have that one beautiful day.
Yeah, like, we gotta clean our garden.
Yeah, we want to get outside and play in the mud in the garden. There are other things you can do in your garden besides cleaning up all that leaf litter, because if we have another frost, which we will always have through Memorial Day weekend, it seems around here, a lot of those insects are going to die because you remove that insulation, or you remove them, threw them in a landfill. So it's little things that each and every one of us can do that can make a really big difference, because a huge percentage of the land in this country, I'll focus on the United States, is privately owned through residential landowners, and you can't rely on the park services and nature conservancies to do all the work because we own so much of the land ourselves. So we have to practice all of these things as well in order to help these insect populations.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting how you said, like, the deer, like the deer repellent plants, because like it's how they market them, because it's just not native.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there are native plants that deer do that are deer resistant.
Yeah.
So thank goodness they're finally tagging them as like native or invasive. Like I'm seeing them starting to do this, but just 2 years ago we had a very relatively large, very commercialized greenhouse, and we were looking for plants to support pollinators, and I would ask the greenhouse personnel, like, where is this plant from? And they had no idea. I was like, how do you not know that? because what's been important to consumers for so long is the aesthetics of the plant.
Right.
How does it look?
Mm-hmm.
Can it withstand drought? Does it need to be watered? Does it go in the sun and the shade? And are deer going to eat it?
Yeah.
So they know those, they have those questions answered like that. But if you ask them something about where these plants are from, I was shocked that they had no idea. We had to look everything up on our phone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's disappointing.
It is.
So you were one of the pioneers of the East-West Community Garden. How was this started, and how have you seen it grow?
So I love the East-West Community Garden. It's something I hold near and dear to my heart, but it has been a challenge. The garden has been a challenge. It was started by a wonderful group of people on campus, faculty and staff, that actually a lot of them are on the Laudato Si committee now. But we had this vision. We actually started a Sustainability Institute, which now is part of the Laudato Si. And one of the first things that we envisioned that we could do on a relatively short period of time was start this East-West Community Garden. And so it not only serves as a place for community members in the surrounding community to grow organic food in a food desert area, but we also wanted to provide a green space for wildlife in an urban area. So we have pollinator gardens there as well, and native plants throughout. And we've actually, some of my students did a study where they looked at the amount of the pollinator diversity in our garden compared to other gardens. And we had really relatively and significantly the highest diversity of pollinators in our garden compared to, they looked at 4 others in the Buffalo area. So it's doing its job. But I'll say how it's grown. I don't think the garden itself has grown. I think we, the people who are running it and managing it, have grown, and that we've learned that in order to have a successful community garden, you really need to establish a relationship with the community members.
Yeah.
And we were very naive, thinking, all right, we're going to build a community garden and the community is going to come.
Yeah.
And we went to some of their meetings, but going to a handful of block club meetings is not establishing a relationship. So that's been one of the biggest challenges, is building a trusting relationship takes time.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of time. And we're limited in the time that we each have, because this is something we're doing in addition to everything else, so it's a slow process. But we're getting there.
Yeah.
We're getting there. And one of the things I just did while I was in St. Louis was I visited a community garden, and I noticed that they have some of the same challenges we have, so it was a little bit of a relief to know, okay, it's not just us.
Right, yeah.
Not only with maintaining the garden, but also developing that relationship with the community members. So I'm hoping with the new director of the New Buffalo Institute.
I was going to say the same thing, yeah.
That I'm going to give her a little time to she just started, but then I'm going to be knocking on her door, and I'm hoping that she can
create those connections for us. Yeah. And is that your vision for it in the future, to have?
Yes, I would say something that I have grown very passionate about is the diversity, equity, and inclusion as well. It is. I really envision, I actually met with a woman, Rita, last week, she has a food pantry, and so if we don't have enough community members, what we're going to do is grow food and just donate it to the food pantry.
Yeah.
But my vision is really to see the community,
Yeah, that would be
more
amazing.
Involved.
Yeah.
And
then connect the Canisius community with those local community members. That'd be just really powerful.
Exactly. We have we're in such a unique position with where the university is.
Yeah.
We need to establish relationships
and not be a little island,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Be part of the community.
Right.
So we had our Juneteenth campus celebration last Thursday, right before I went out of town, and I just get so fired up by these things, because I really, it's something I've felt since I arrived at Canisius, is we're not part of the community, and we're headed in that direction. So I'm excited.
That's really great to see.
Hopeful.
Yeah. So, and then I know you're involved outside of the school environment as well. Could you explain your role as a member of the board of directors of the Western New York Land Conservancy and your goals as an organization?
Absolutely. So it has been such a privilege and honor to be able to serve on the board of this amazing organization. I love what I do here at Canisius. I love teaching. I love doing my research, but there was an emptiness in me a little bit, because I want to be part of the conservation in itself, beyond teaching and engaging the next generation. And yes, I do some really neat stuff with insects, but it's such a small niche field I work in. I wanted to do something bigger. So it's just perfect timing how it happened. But I've been serving a little over a year now, and it's just such an amazing organization. It's incredible. Their staff is so talented. I can't even go through all the amazing things they're doing, but check out their webpage. They're doing stuff with respect to wildlife conservation and corridors, and they have the Western New York Wildway, which is this linkage map that's going to connect all of these regions that they're protecting, and it's continuous, so it allows wildlife to have these corridors and routes to migrate, which they're going to have to do in the face of climate change. Everyone, even if they're not migratory, everything's going to need to migrate, shift their distribution. So that is just amazing. And then they do a lot with DEI as well. So they have the Riverline Project, which is right on the Buffalo River. And it's an area of, it's just vacant land, but they're converting it to a natural, native plant inhabited area that people who live in the surrounding area who don't have access to natural lands. They don't have the transportation to get to nature conservancies or nature preserves around the area. They need something that's readily available for them right there in the city.
Right.
And so that's an amazing initiative that they're taking on. And then they're also really passionate about conserving local farmland so that we can produce. We have the capacity to produce our food locally.
Mm-hmm.
And they not only protect farmland just over the Western New York region, but they also have the Providence Farm Collective, which is a farmland in Orchard Park that is permanently preserved for refugee and minority populations to grow and farm their
Very
food.
cool.
So
yeah.
they're doing, and this is just scratching the surface. They have so
Right.
many initiatives, but it's amazing. I'm on the conservation committee for the organization in addition to serving on the board. And it's just such a privilege to be a part of all of these different initiatives and see how, like, what I teach in the classroom, what I learned, as an ecologist, see how it's actually practiced in the field.
Yeah, that's so great.
How they actually accomplish these massive tasks with just a handful of people. It's been amazing. I've learned so much, and I've been able to take a lot of what I've learned back into the classroom.
That's so great.
It's been awesome. Yeah.
It's full circle, like you said, like
It is.
teaching it, then doing it in the field, then bringing it back.
Exactly.
That's so great.
Yeah.
So what are some ways in which you make earth-friendly choices in your life?
In everything we do. Like I said, it needs to be part of everybody's life. I also think, though, that there's too much pressure and responsibility put on individuals, civilians, and consumers.
Yes.
Most of the pollution, emissions, and pollution such as plastic pollution come from corporations. So they need to be accountable and they need to play their part.
Yeah.
There's too much guilt put on civilians. This is not our fault. We consume what is readily made available to us. Mm-hmm. And our culture makes it difficult and challenging to make earth-friendly choices.
Yeah, definitely,
it does. Or it's expensive.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things my son and I did over COVID is we decided, because we were bored, and let's see how much plastic we consume in our home in a month. I wanted to do it over a year, but it would have been way too much plastic. So for a month, we kept every plastic wrapper, every plastic container. Yeah. And then we weighed it all in these different categories, and we produced pounds. It was pounds of plastic in 1 month for 3 people, and we are conscious of it.
Yeah.
But most of it came from food packaging,
right?
And because a lot of the times you don't have a choice. With what you have access to. Frozen berries are going to be in a plastic container, in a plastic wrap. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the things we buy are in plastic wraps. So just doing that little home study was eye-opening, and then I'm more conscious about where we go shopping, and especially like produce is the big thing.
Yeah.
But again, a lot of it is out of our hands. It's out of our hands, but because of what's available and how it's manufactured and what it's packaged in. But little things like we have reusable containers that we have all of our cleaning products in.
Great.
We've tried, but it did not go well, to use like bar soap shampoo, which was interesting.
Yeah. Well, you tried it.
We tried it. Yeah. We just don't use plastic with anything. We'll even bring containers out when we eat out for our own
that's great.
takeout.
Yeah.
Little things like that. But again, I think there needs to be a shift that's bigger than you and I, and let me see if there was anything else I put in there. Yeah. And then also just in our yard, some of the things I was talking about, we've been shifting to native plants. We've been removing invasive species that we find on our property. We're converting part of our yard, part of our lawn to a meadow, which has been interesting.
Yeah.
And we actually got our property certified as a wildlife habitat, which you can do through the National Wildlife Federation. If you check different boxes of providing habitat and food and water and native plants versus invasive plants. So there's a lot of different things as I mentioned earlier, that individuals can do just to make a little bit of a difference.
Yeah. Definitely. That's
collectively
awesome.
It can be a big difference.
Right. So we all know that becoming a sustainable individual is a process, like we talked about. It's not easy. So what are some things that you hope to implement in your life?
Yeah. Again, reduce plastic, even more so.
Yeah.
It's less than 20% of that plastic we put in those recycling bins is actually recycled, but we still put it all in there.
Right. I know people are so hopeful, but it's really.
But that really is. And then shopping locally, but we try our best. But there's a lot of instances we could do more, and that just reduces the carbon footprint on any item to get there, and also supports your local community members. We're all in my family vegetarian. Mm-hmm. I still want to go fully vegan.
Yeah.
It's very hard though. It's again where our surroundings do make it difficult.
Right.
I swear it would be easy if I never ate out or never went to a party where there was pizza or anything, if I had complete control.
Yeah.
Because it is much easier than it was, but food choices have an impact on the earth and its resources. So if anybody could just reduce their meat intake by a little bit each week, that will also make a difference.
Right, yeah.
So we ultimately want to go vegan. But yeah, we think about it with everything we do.
Right, that's so great. And then what are some ways that Canisius can help you make these changes?
See availability of more sustainable products. We're pushing to get non-plastic beverage containers in vending machines. Takeout containers could be reduced. Plastic water bottles should just not even be an option. They should not be a thing, yeah. They really need to get the refillable water bottle stations in every building.
Right.
And just again, like make it part of the culture. Make it part of the entire culture on campus instead of this separate, distinct committee or movement or initiative. It just needs to be intertwined with everything.
I agree.
Yeah.
And this is a little bit what we talked about, but what is your vision for sustainability on campus?
That's exactly what I said. It's just part of our culture. I love how every generation it's more and more part of the culture. Yeah. Just with it amazes me how much you guys know. Because I remember when I was your age, like you only knew if you were in the field. But just generally speaking, your generation is so much more informed. But it has to be part of everyone's thing. Part of the campus culture, part of society's culture, and we'll get there. It's just we're so stinking slow. Yeah. We will get there though, because we'll realize it's the only way.
Right.
Yeah, it's the only way.
And then if folks are interested in becoming more involved in the campus gardens or your research on campus, how should they contact you?
Email is the best way. So my email address is COSTANZ, the letter 4, at canisius.edu. I'm really good at checking my email, so you should hear back from me.
She is, yes.
Within 24 to 48 hours.
And then is there anything you'd like to add, Dr. Costanzo, before we end?
Just thank you for doing this. This is very important. Again, I'm excited that this is a podcast and you're writing it up, and people will have exposure. I wanted to end actually with a quote from one of my favorite ecologists, Edward O. Wilson. He was actually an entomologist. He worked with insects. So he's had a profound impact on me and in my life as a scientist and even as a human being. Not just being an entomologist, but he's also a naturalist, an ecologist. He's really big in the land conservation movement as well. Yeah. He passed away in 2021. It's a big loss, but his work and his philosophy is going to live on forever. But I love his quote here. that humanity is a biological species living in a biological environment. Because like all species, we are exquisitely adapted in everything, from our behavior to our genetics to our physiology to that particular environment in which we live. The earth is our home. Unless we preserve the rest of life as a sacred duty, we will be endangering ourselves by destroying the home in which we evolved and on which we are completely dependent.
It's a good one. That's
It is.
Very nice quote.
It is. He's amazing.
So thank you so much for taking time to speak with me today.
Absolutely. This has been great.
Oh,
it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.